Well, thanks for having me, everybody. I'm sorry I've been a little cryptic about communication about the flyer. I've been on the road a lot. I do a lot of these talks all over the world, talking about the relationship between science and democracy, science and law, and the rise of authoritarianism and what people who care about reason and science can do. So there are a number of different countries that have done something that was kind of patterned on an initiative that I and a couple of friends started many years ago called sciencedebate.org. And we noticed in the run-up to the 2008 election that none of the candidates were talking about any of the really big science issues that were facing the country on a policy level. And that were affecting really everybody's lives more and more as science was becoming more and more advanced and impacting not only the global environment but health, psychology, the economy, questions like climate change, but there was a whole host of other ones. So we started this organization called sciencedebate.org to promote this idea of candidates actually debating the things that are affecting life these days instead of the things that were affecting life 50 or 100 years ago. And we ran into a lot of resistance from the candidates who thought that that maybe we're trying to catch them up and make them, trick them and embarrass them. Then we had to reassure them that no, that wasn't the case. We're really interested in their policy perspectives on these things. What were they going to do about climate change? What were they going to do about investments in health research? Or what were they going to do about emerging issues at the time, which have become even bigger issues about privacy or about robotics and their impact on the economy? As we've seen, those issues have had large impacts. Robotics and automation have in some ways driven a lot of what went on in this last election by driving so many people out of their jobs with more efficient technology. And yet there's been virtually no communication about this from presidential candidates in the advance of this. So we've heard now reactionary communication about it, but we were trying to get candidates to talk about it in advance. Now, we did successfully get them to participate online. We got Barack Obama and John McCain to participate online, answer the top American science questions. I dogged them both until they finally relented. And then, persistence, right there. Then in 2012, we got Barack Obama and Mitt Romney to answer a similar set of questions. Each time we would crowdsource these from American citizens who were concerned about science-driven issues and engineering-driven issues. And then I assembled a kind of a group of pretty much the top science and engineering-related organizations. And we'd kind of cull through those thousands and thousands of submissions and figure out really what, some were very similar. And so we kind of work them down into the top most important issues. And then we'd ask the candidates. This last time we got Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Jill Stein, and Gary Johnson to answer. I had bets. A lot of people, I made easy money. A lot of people thought that Donald Trump would never respond. So I cleaned up pretty well when I got him to answer. But this is something that a lot of people around the world have recognized as a growing issue, that science and technology is impacting so much of life that we really need to get politicians who often come from the humanities and don't really have much exposure to it to begin to talk about it on the campaign trail so that we can get ahead of some of these problems. So that's one of the things that I do when I travel to different countries is I talk about that initiative, what we did in the US, how we actually got them to respond, and help science journalists or others who are interested in this structure them in different places. Now, what really drove this book and how I'm going to kind of launch into this talk, which will be about an hour, I hope that's okay, and then we'll do a Q&A afterwards, was as we were in 2008, as we had organized this debate, we'd had all this pushback from the candidates. We actually set up a debate at the Franklin Institute in downtown Philadelphia. We partnered with PBS. They were going to broadcast it nationally. Paula Apsel, the producer of Nova, was our producer. David Brancaccio was going to moderate. And So we had the whole thing turnkey ready to go, and the candidates still wouldn't commit. And we're going back and forth up to the last minute when all of a sudden they said, no, sorry, we can't do it. And instead, Clinton and Obama at that time attended the Compassion Forum at Messiah College in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where they talked about faith and values issues. And that struck me as a remarkable moment in American history, when candidates for president were more willing to talk about faith and values, something that had up until that point been considered politically something you didn't talk about because it's divisive. Different people have different perspectives on it. But they were more willing to talk about that than they were about science and engineering issues. So something had happened to make science more taboo than faith and values on the political campaign trail. And that's what led me into really understanding or seeking to understand what was going on and writing on the topic. So I'm going to take you through kind of some of the things that I found out. First, what is happening really? Well, to really understand what is happening, we have to understand kind of the basis of American law and how it intersects with science. And that goes back to Thomas Jefferson, who was a lawyer and a scientist. Like one of his idols, Francis Bacon before him. Francis Bacon had been the Attorney General of England, but he was also credited with inventing what we think of today as the scientific method. And both of them were very interested in circumscribing authoritarians, and doing that with the power of law informed by evidence. And this is kind of the tree where science and research come together with law and with our thinking about law. And I trace a lot of the philosophical roots that Jefferson was drawing on and how law and science both emerged from Protestant religion, at least the law and science that we think of. And were both, in different ways, efforts to limit the king's authority. So in thinking about this, Jefferson said, wherever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. But that's the question today when science is becoming so advanced. Is it possible for people still, the average American voter, to be well informed in a day when a cell phone is roughly equivalent to magic? Both of these items, Harry Potter's broom and this iPhone, are made by people cloistered away wearing long robes and uttering strange incantations. And Arthur C. Clarke kind of put it well many years ago when he said, sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. The problem that happens when that occurs, though, is it makes us vulnerable to disinformation. Because if technology or if science, if we don't know how it works, it just becomes a matter of belief, we just trust in it, then all of a sudden we become vulnerable to what anybody tells us about it. So in that case, we see policy aberrations happening. For instance, in 2011, the World Health Organization issued a report saying that your cell phone could cause brain cancer. And I looked at that report and I saw that actually the statistical blip that they found was below the noise level. So while the statement was technically correct, anything actually could cause cancer if you look at it that way. But is the probability that something's going to cause cancer very high? No. If it's not distinguishable from random noise in the environment, you can't honestly say that that's a legitimate argument. In this case, if we take a look at the electromagnetic spectrum, we see that microwaves, which is what cell phones use, a microwave photon is a little bit more energetic than a radio wave photon, but it's far less energy in it than the infrared radiation that our skin is giving off as we sit here. We're all emitting about 70 to 90 watts of radiation right now, and certainly less energetic than the visible light. It's not until you get all the way up to the top end of visible light, the bottom end of ultraviolet light, that a photon has enough energy to knock an electron out of its valence in a carbon atom, changing how that might chemically bond, thus perhaps altering our DNA and causing cancer. But you have to know a little bit about biology, a little bit about physics, a little bit about chemistry, and be able to synthesize that knowledge with some confidence, put it together to realize why it's impossible for your cell phone to cause brain cancer. In fact, if you go back through history, you'd recognize by looking at the photon's energy that that's actually part of what Albert Einstein won his Nobel Prize for. It's such reliable knowledge now that a lot of our technology is based on it. So yet, because of this confusion, probably driven by the word radiation and by the fact that this technology is so advanced that how it works is somewhat invisible, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, all of them Democrats, voted 10-1 to require every cell phone shop in San Francisco to warn you that your cell phone might cause brain cancer. It's an example of a bad regulation. In their defense, they argued that, well, you know, if you don't know, when in doubt, leave out. But that's not actually a logical argument, because you can say that about anything, right? Water might cause you to die. If you don't drink it, of course, if you're exposed to a tsunami, which is roughly the equivalent difference here, it could kill you. So should you leave water out of your diet? Probably not. So that kind of argument didn't make any sense, and yet they were based public policy on it. Now, we are faced with a situation where lots and lots of these increasingly advanced policy issues that are driven by science are coming to the fore, and we become stuck on all of them because we don't know how to talk about them in our democratic policy process because of that issue about the gap between the well-informed voter and what we're actually doing now with science and technology. Anybody want to take a guess what these blue lines represent? Airline routes, satellites. Close. They're Facebook connections. This is China right there. You see it's kind of dark. We call that the Great Firewall of China. They block most Western social media. But this might just as well be internet connections between scientists and engineers working together. In the last 40 years, we have seen a vast change in how we do science and research in general around the world. Scientists are no longer, thanks to the internet, required to be in the same room, in the same lab, in the same time zone, even in the same country. They can work across the internet with each other and frequently do. In addition to that, we have seen a vast increase in the number of scientists and engineers. So we've seen a qualitative difference in their ability to work together and a quantitative difference in the number of scientists and engineers at work, so that in fact in the next 20 to 40 years we're projected to create as much new knowledge as we have since the beginning of the scientific revolution. Now if you think about some of the social upheavals that past discoveries have caused, from whether or not the Earth is at the center of the universe, or maybe it's the sun, or maybe it's not either of them, to the development of evolution, both of these things had there were arguments certainly between science and ideological perspectives, but they had very large social and legal implications and political implications in society. Now multiply that times 10 or 20, and you can expect that the next couple of decades is going to be kind of a rocky ride unless we find a better way of incorporating advanced knowledge into our political process. So the question emerges is, are the people still well enough informed to be trusted with their own government? And I think you have to kind of take both of the signs together. And yet, this is, in a way, this is Joe Q. Public. This is the person, a representation of the person that is charged with making intelligent decisions, at least in Thomas Jefferson's view of self-governance. So judging from Congress, of course, there they all are hard at work on their laptops, the answer is probably not. Of the 535 members in Congress, how many do you suppose have a professional background in science or engineering? You guys are cynics. Come on. 5, 4, 2, 3, 1, none? Pardon?
Are you including lawyers?
I'm talking about people who have a professional background in science or engineering.
Are you called doctors?
There's 11. No, I don't count doctors because doctors are not necessarily evidence-based. So physicians may be scientific in their orientation, but then you have people like Paul Brown, who was a member of Congress. It was a physician who said that he doesn't trust all that evolution stuff and embryology. That's just lies straight from the pit of hell, sent to fool you. So I would suggest if you ever get sick in Georgia, where he's from, don't go see him. There are 11, less than 2%. There's a microbiologist, a physicist, Bill Foster, the only PhD in Congress. He's sitting in Denny Hastert's old seat in Illinois. A chemist and 8 engineers. By contrast, how many do you suppose are lawyers?
Too many.
Too many.
There are 218 lawyers in Congress, according to the Congressional Research Service, in this current Congress, which is about 41% of the membership. Now, the reason that this is interesting and important is that lawyers and scientists approach problems of fact from very different perspectives. A lawyer is going to look at both sides of an issue, and they're going to view it as that, as an issue that has two sides. And they're going to research the side that supports their premise, their desired outcome, and they'll research the side that has evidence that might argue against their desired outcome, just in order to develop strategy to refute that evidence. The idea, though, is to start with a desired outcome, and then you rely on the judge, the jury, or in the case of Congress, the body as a whole, to decide who has made the more compelling argument. That is the exact opposite of how a scientist is going to approach a problem. They are never going to start with a conclusion and attempt to build a proof of that conclusion. That's a sure way to fool yourself, because oftentimes nature defies what we call common sense. And scientists have to protect against confirmation bias, which all too readily jumps into that gap there. So a scientist is generally going to start by looking at, by making a hypothesis about what might be going on in nature, making some risky predictions that could be disproved, and then developing as much evidence as they can on both sides of that argument so they can make a meaningful statement about nature. Now, in a day and age when science is driving so many different things and there's so much technical knowledge that's required to even understand, for instance, things like the internet in order to regulate it properly, that becomes an increasing problem, those two different approaches to thinking about issues. And the reason that it's especially timely today is that it's impacting, as I said, every issue on the planet. So I'm going to give you some examples of what this is beginning to do to our politics. Of course, some of you are probably remember the Republican presidential debate in front of Air Force One, CNN debate, where Donald Trump went on about autism and about vaccines causing autism, but also denying that climate change is actually happening. He says it's a Chinese hoax. And then there's Lamar Smith, Texas number 21 district, who is the chair of what is now called by many the House Anti-Science Committee, because he is kind of the bête noire of the science community. He's made it his personal issue to elevate climate deniers and give them a platform in his committee and denigrate scientists. Then we see this happening also in state legislatures, which are really the kind of the development pool, the farm team, if you will, for Congress. For instance, here we go in North Carolina, where they banned sea level rise. This was because well, what they did was they required zoning officials in coastal communities who were issuing permits for roads, where you take into account roadbed height, or for construction close to the coast. They couldn't use what scientists said about what sea level rise was occurring and how we were projecting it over the coming 40 to 50 years. they had to only use the approved numbers by the state legislature, which I don't know how many of you remember the Cultural Revolution in China, but that really seems very much like an authoritarian approach, not a democratic approach, where you had to take the politically correct numbers. It's also happening, however, on city levels. Here's an example: the city of Snowmass banning fluoride because they are afraid that fluoride dumbs you down, that it causes intellectual problems, despite the fact that it's been in most Americans' water, in cities anyway, for the last 60, 70 years, and is considered one of the greatest health benefits by the CDC, one of the 10 greatest health benefits. For those who don't know, fluoride is actually a naturally occurring mineral in groundwater. It's considered a nutrient, and actually fluoridation isn't really adding a chemical, it's either elevating or reducing fluoride levels to the optimal level. But in the absence of real knowledge about this, there are growing movements all over the country on fluoride, or on vaccination and autism and pop culture, or even worldwide. In Australia, there was a large campaign to ban fluoride in several different communities. But in Canada, you may remember under the Harper administration, all the attacks on science that happened there, and the closing or the destruction of documents from the DFO libraries, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and how Canada lost a lot of its knowledge about its own fisheries. Or in France, where there's an active vaccine denial or anti-vax movement, where the measles is really getting a strong resurgence. Or in the United Kingdom, which is actually the birthplace of the anti-vaccine movement, where Michael Gove talked about how Britain has had enough of experts in the run-up to the Brexit campaign. This general rejection that is tied with anti-science becoming acceptable politically is also tied with the rise of authoritarianism. A move away from the idea that there are facts out there that are objective that we can all agree on to settle an argument, and more towards, I don't care what you say, what I say wins because I have the biggest stick or the loudest megaphone. Then in Germany and Poland, there's a lot of creationism that's moving into children's textbooks. In Ireland, again, a new effort to ban fluoride. In fact, the city of Dublin has completely banned it. The entire the entire country of Israel banned fluoride, and then also banned Wi-Fi. Their health minister was a history graduate. They've since undone some of those things. They've, I think, reversed some of that. And then in Nigeria, of course, there's the rise of groups like Boko Haram, whose very name means Western knowledge is forbidden, or books are forbidden. So there's an anti-science movement that seems to be growing around the world. In China, it's very strong. There's a very strong environmental movement in China. And coupled with that is a suspicion of genetically modified food. And the interesting thing about GMO crops, anyway, that many people don't know is there's a greater consensus of scientists that say that eating genetically modified food is safe than there are that say that humans are causing climate change. And yet, environmentally minded folks often reject GMO food. And that's happening particularly in China, where there's a very strong environmental movement. They think that GMO food is an attempt by Americans to control their minds. So what could be happening? Well, to understand really what's happening, we first have to understand kind of the relationship of science to politics. And why I often say is science is never partisan, but it's always political. Why? Because science creates knowledge. As we know, that famous line, knowledge is power, right? And power has an impact on the world. It either confirms or challenges somebody's vested interests. So probably a better way to think about politics is not necessarily just a left-right continuum between conservative and progressive, but also to realize that there's a vertical component to this between anti-authoritarian, or the classic word liberal. By the way, it is possible to be a liberal conservative. That's not a contradiction in terms, even though it's never rarely used anymore. But between anti-authoritarians and authoritarians. And I would contend that that's a lot of the argument that we are seeing going on in our politics today, that in fact much of our politics has shifted from a left-right tension to a more vertical authoritarian and anti-authoritarian tension. And that's why we see voters, for instance, beginning to ignore political parties and vote for the person. And that's why we see democracies threatened by authoritarians. In the last month, we've seen 2 democracies essentially fall to authoritarian dictators. And there are several more that are kind of teetering. That is something that we would have thought of as unthinkable 10, 15 years ago. So as the political compass has tilted a little bit more towards the vertical, it's creating new dynamics in our politics, and much of that centers around our ideas about facts and the role of evidence in making decisions. So to understand this in the United States anyway, let's take a look at the emotional movements that have really helped it occur. Now, about 100 years ago, science was really seen as something that was certainly bipartisan and a source of great pride, because new knowledge was quickly commercialized, created new economies, new jobs, powered towns forward, and it had a very general positive affect in society. Aside from things like, for instance, the challenge under the Scopes monkey trial in the 1920s around quote-unquote Darwinism. But then in 1945, that public attitude towards science really began to shift after we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There was a lot of discussion in public, in newspapers and magazines, on the radio at the time, even with famous generals debating whether or not the United States were technological giants and moral and ethical infants, and whether our ability with what we could do with science had outstripped our moral and ethical capacity. So doubt about science began to become the watchword. This was transformed about 12 years later into fear. In 1949, the Soviets had exploded their own atomic bomb, and in 1957 launched Sputnik, which didn't make much news for the first couple times around, but as politicians really began to think about it, they realized if Russians can do that, maybe they can launch an intercontinental ballistic missile and they can put a nuclear warhead on it. And suddenly the idea of Russians being up there in space transformed our relationship to science as one of fear, which really promoted the science race and the space race, which was a defense-driven initiative at its root. So JFK really set the goal to land on the moon, which was a public relations goal in a way, but also a way of really driving our investment in science and technology to beat the Soviets. At the same time, though, as we funded that, we really had to develop new techniques for spending that money. Scientists realized with some astuteness that if they authorized funding of public dollars for some nonsensical kind of research, it could quickly be a scandal that could wipe out public funding for science. So they had to develop a method of judging what were worthy projects to fund. And they came up with this grant-making approach where scientists would submit grant applications that would be reviewed by other scientists. This was a great idea, but there was one thing that they forgot about including, and that was public input. Up until that point, the scientists that were public were very public. Edwin Hubble, for instance, would travel around the country and speak to standing room only crowds of 5,000 people about what he was seeing through the telescope on the top of Mount Wilson. These types of relationships were necessary because scientists relied on public support from philanthropists, but also public positive attitude in order to get funding and to have support for their research. Now suddenly that relationship vanished. Scientists began to turn inward to their labs and to each other for grant approval, and we saw a time then emerge when as science was making some of its most dizzying advances, probably the most ever because of that inflection of public dollars, there was almost no communication going on with the public. So that left a communication gap that was eventually filled with worry. After World War II, there was a lot of concern about GIs returning home, and maybe there would be another Great Depression, because how would we find jobs for everybody? That fired a lot of investment in things like the GI Bill, getting education, in public support for new community development, and in quickly commercializing some of the industrial applications that had been developed during the war, like for instance the use of DDT to protect soldiers from malaria. They spread DDT throughout a lot of South Pacific islands. Well, if it worked there, we should probably scale it up and use it throughout the United States. And this was done with a lot of technological inventions in a way that we came to call the military-industrial complex. All the industrial companies that had completely retooled their production lines for the war effort now needed to transform that into a commercial production system in the 1950s and 1960s. This began to boomerang, though. We rushed products out there like DDT without really understanding the larger systemic implications of that. Setting up a type of relationship between science and politics that we've seen over and over again, where new discoveries are quickly commercialized, and then maybe 10 or 15 years later, environmental science, systems science begins to realize that there are some consequences that we hadn't anticipated, and say, well, we got to regulate that. And then the industry that has in the meantime been built up, made huge investments, multi-billion-dollar investments in this, is placed in a situation where they feel like they are in an existential crisis, and they fight back. And the way that they fight back is by casting doubt on the science. This happened with the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, where petrochemical companies really attacked her as a person and created doubt about the science, taking some lines out of the playbook from tobacco denial that the tobacco companies had been developing for the previous 10 years or so, and scaling them up even much larger in attacking public ideas about pesticides. But this gave rise to the environmental movement and environmental science. Around the same time, there was a lot, as this industrial battle was going on, there was growing discomfort about what we could do with the biological sciences, particularly over the human reproductive cycle, our growing control over that. This is a copy of a Time magazine from the time, worrying about the test tube baby. Religious conservatives at the time thought that maybe test tube babies wouldn't have souls. Now we call them in vitro fertilization, and so far the evidence seems to suggest that they're like everybody else. But these were legitimate moral and ethical debates that were going on at the time, because nobody really understood, or at least the non-scientists understood, what science was saying about human reproduction. So what we wound up seeing is a split that occurred around science in the biosciences and the environmental sciences. And on one half of that split was threatened industry and threatened religion. And on the other half was science and the environmentalists. And if you think about our politics as it has emerged since that time, you can begin to see how that may determine a large share of what's going on in our politics today, and particularly around issues of science denial and of alternative facts and the rise of authoritarianism. There was also another factor that I should mention that happened a little bit later that helped to drive this, and that was the ending of the Cold War. Up until that time, if you remember, we were really funding our investments in science and technology because we needed to keep up with the Russians and to repel the Soviet threat. But when the Cold War ended, immediately after that, you really saw increase in the political acceptability of attacking science in different ways, and the slow erosion in public support and public funding of science and of research. So what has transpired in the days since? Well, on the right, political right, if you will call it that, I don't know if it can really still be called that, but you've seen the argument or the fear about creeping socialism, and that science is really a stalking horse for socialists and for socialism and for communists and collectivism and all the things that Ayn Rand hated. And the anti-science arising out of that fear generally centers around climate change, evolution, reproduction, and now more recently, vaccination. Vaccine anti-science used to be a more leftist or liberal, progressive type thing, but now it's become more of a conservative thing also because it's based on the ideas that the government shouldn't tell you what to put in your body. It's more of a libertarian point of view. Now, on the political left, the anti-science has been more about blowing up fears that are not supported by the evidence. That precautionary principle that the San Francisco Board of Supervisors used, and the anti-science there, since you can't trust corporations to do anything right, and since federal agencies may be regulatory captured by corporate interests, then the anti-science is about suspicion over mainstream medicine, the idea that cell phones may cause brain cancer and we're just covering it up, or that vaccines may cause autism, we're just covering it up, or that there's EMF pollution affects your mind and your thinking, that fluoridation is dumbing us down and is a source of disposal of industrial chemicals and we're just covering it up, or that GMOs are unsafe to eat. Now, I should say that the GMO question is kind of interesting because there is a moral and ethical question about whether corporations should own and control a genome. But that is separate from the question of whether or not they're safe to eat. There's no extra ingredients added in genetically modified food. It's just more precise breeding that we've always done. In fact, it's less dangerous than what some people say is organic food. You can use a process called mutagenesis, where you expose a seed to radiation and cancer-causing chemicals, cause its DNA to change, thereby altering it, plant that, and call it organic. So this idea of hidden dangers is really driving a lot of that suspicion. On the right, then, the motivation is anti-regulatory, anti-reproductive control, and pro-corporate, and on the left, it's pro-environment, pro-regulation, pro-choice, and anti-corporate. So you can kind of see a lot of the arguments that have been going on more recently in our politics emerging here around this. The theme on the right is liberal scientists with a socialist agenda want to control your life and limit your freedom. That's something I actually heard Rush Limbaugh say at one point, I think, or something very close to it. And on the left, it's impersonal doctors, greedy corporations, and mechanistic scientists hide the real dangers to our health, the environment, and our spirits. Now, it's important to note that since we've created and funded the science-granting bodies, a lot of this discussion, in fact, almost all of it, has gone on without the input of scientists until recently, actually. So who's doing this? Who's waging the war on science? It's coming from three battlefields, and I'm going to cover each of them in brief here. The first is the identity politics war on science. Now, this emerged post-war also. The idea that science was associated with the military-industrial complex really couldn't be trusted, and in fact was just a meta-narrative, in the word of postmodernists, that was just a story that the powerful elite told in order to make you leave them in power. And that it had no more validity or no more truth than any other way of knowing, than indigenous ways of knowing, or female ways of knowing, or white male ways of knowing, or black ways of knowing, or LGBT ways of knowing. All these political identity groups had just as much validity as science, and in fact probably more, because you really couldn't say that there's objective knowledge. The only way you can really know something is to live it. And so instead of objectivity, the byword then became authenticity. And you had to have an authentic experience in order to be able to talk about it. So if you're not black, you can't talk about being black. And writers who aren't black can't write about being black. If you're not a woman or a man, you can't write about the other gender. So this wound up creating a lot of very interesting political discussions but it also aligned well with the civil rights movement, and more broadly then became accepted in our public dialogue without much more examination, to the point that recently a friend of mine who teaches at a college, teaches screenwriting, he sits on the board of the tenure board, and he was sitting in the back of a classroom of a teacher that was teaching, and he heard her say, we can't really know that the earth goes around the sun. And he pulled her aside afterwards and said, no, that's just a rhetorical question, right? You're trying to get a rise out of the students maybe? And she says, no, we can't know that. So he thought, I can't in good conscience, vote for tenure for her. We're supposed to be creating well-informed citizens as part of our charge. We don't want somebody that's spreading nonsense. So he went to the tenure committee, and he made that same argument. And the other members of the committee thought about it, and they said, you know what, we think she's right. You can't really know. Science has overturned all kinds of things in the past. Haven't you read Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions? That past worldviews have been overturned, so we don't know that this one won't be either. When in fact, actually, that's never the way that has happened. There's never been revolutions that have completely overturned past scientific knowledge. They've expanded upon it, where past scientific knowledge has become a special case of a larger knowledge. For instance, Newtonian physics is a special case. It still works perfectly fine. It got us to the moon and back. That's a special case of the larger general relativity. So this idea of what is objective and whether or not we can objectively make any statements, or whether, for instance, if we're being an anthropologist, we can't go into an indigenous culture somewhere and make any objective statements about whether or not what is happening there is moral and ethically correct, for instance, because all we're doing is imposing our own cultural view on it. And yet, if any one of us sticks a ruler in a bucket of water after rain, we're probably going to all come up with the same measurement. So there is something to this scientific method. In fact, the whole idea of the scientific method is to strip away what we know from all these other sources of bias, all these things that make us who we are and yet that color our perspective. And that is what bonds us together across our differences, is this idea that there is an objective knowledge, that no matter who we are, we can rely on it and find what's true. Unfortunately, though, this idea has become endemic in our journalist education. J schools for the last 2 generations now have taught this idea that there's no such thing as objectivity. And it's throughout, for instance, new reporter guidelines. Here is one from the Voice of San Diego. There's no such thing as objectivity. Famous journalists repeated on the speaking circuit. There's Linda Ellerby saying there's no such thing as objectivity. Even Nick Gillespie, the editor-in-chief of Reason.com, an objectivist publication, is quoted as saying there's no such thing as objectivity. And you think if anybody believed in objectivity, it would be an objectivist. So part of this has then developed into a kind of a different way of journalists viewing how to get at a story. Journalists will say there's always 2 sides, right? Bob says 2 + 2 is 4. Julie says it's 6. Maybe Julie has a legitimate reason for her perspective. And of course, you're going to read that story to see what the hell she could be thinking. Scientists will say most times one side is objectively wrong, right? I can show you with these apples that Bob is right and the only controversy is why you're covering this. And then, of course, a politician will say, how about a compromise? And we'll have a new law, 2 + 2 = 5. And that's kind of Washington in a nutshell right now. The problem with this is it's something called false balance. It's the false equivalence of knowledge, which is supported by the evidence, with opinion, which is not. Oftentimes you will see journalists who take this kind of laissez-faire view of reporting, wash their hands of trying to make a judgment about what is real and what is not, and present, for instance, on the issue of climate change, a scientist speaking with all the known evidence developed over the last 50 years and tens of thousands of experiments. And then the other half of the story, because they want to be balanced, they'll put somebody with an opposing opinion. And oftentimes, no matter what the science issue is, that person with the opposing opinion is going to be probably more charismatic and have more convincing sounding arguments because they want to convince you that they're right. They're not out there to lay out what they know, they're out there to convince you by any means that they can. The problem with this is it weights us towards extremes and authoritarianism because it elevates unsupported voices in our public dialogue unjustifiably. In the run-up to, after the run-up to the war in Iraq, David Gregory, NBC News chief White House correspondent at the time, was asked, how come none of you guys in the press corps asked Bush or anybody in his administration to produce evidence really to support this idea that there were weapons of mass destruction before we went, how come you didn't hold them accountable? And he said, I disagree, that's not our role. That's false balance at work in its ultimate extreme, and because it elevates authoritarianism then. If it's not the press's role, whose role is it? The whole idea, at least as Jefferson conceived of it, is journalists were there to hold those in power accountable to the evidence. Not to just wash their hands of democracy, to be an active part in it. Now, the second arm in this attack is the ideological war on science. This is something that has been, of course, going on since Galileo and how he got in the tussle with the church over whether the earth was at the center of the universe or not, and wound up spending the rest of his life under house arrest. Or you've got famous Democrat William Jennings Bryan 100 years ago, arguing or running for president 3 times on the anti-evolution ticket, saying that evolution would undermine social values. Billy Graham, especially after the war then, talking about how we'd elevated man and denigrated God, and therefore the world was going to go to hell in a handbasket. Or more recently, the growth of the new evangelicals and the elevation of the idea of the Great Commission of evangelicalism, or evangelism, the go therefore and make disciples of all nations, essentially an argument for theocracy. So we see people then after the advent of televangelism rising that made this argument that become political forces and that use television to organize politically around what James Dobson said was a civil war of values. And what was driving that civil war of values? It was the growing secularism of society driven by science, largely around origins, human origins, the theory of evolution, control over human reproduction, the ideas about sexuality that science was showing us, that, for instance, there's a spectrum of sexuality throughout the animal kingdom, the ideas about whether or not sex education was helpful or whether we should just do abstinence-only education, sexual orientation, gender, the idea of HPV vaccination. That was a new one that really came out, particularly when our lovely Michelle Bachmann was running for president, talking about whether if we gave girls, 11 or 12-year-old girls, an HPV vaccine, which you want to give before a girl becomes sexually active, you can prevent the leading cause of cervical cancer, one of the big killers. You can completely wipe it out by preventing HPV. And yet, religious conservatives of this ilk are opposed to that because it removes a negative consequence for having sex. Or questions about the origin of the universe and the place of humans in it. So these ideas of origins where science is really trotting upon what is viewed as God's territory in the Bible, in a literalist interpretation of the Bible, and then organizing around that. And we really saw the culmination of that in George Bush's re-election campaign, 2004 re-election, where his advisor Karl Rove had noted that they'd lost 20 million evangelical votes in the 2000 election, and that's why it was so close, and that if they organized in the churches, they could reclaim those votes and he would be re-elected. So Rove, who was an atheist, was described as walking through the West Wing whistling "Onward, Christian Soldiers." and organizing throughout the churches. But you'll notice that a lot of this was politically driven, because since then, this culture wars narrative has really declined in society. You don't hear that heightened awareness and the heightened fraught arguments around it like you once did. This is just kind of a quick illustration from a cartoon book for kids that Ken Ham, a famous creationist, promotes. Here we see this is intended to be kind of a cautionary tale towards religious leaders. Here we see the stupid priests shooting off in the wrong direction, or aiming at each other with their cannons, or shooting just the symptoms of science and evolution. Because we all know that evolution causes these things like divorce and homosexuality and euthanasia and abortion, right? And here's the lone pirate-like evolutionist or scientist hammering away at the foundation of creation. If you're a child and you're brought up with this, and you're surrounded by this kind of thinking, you can understand how it becomes emotionally difficult when you're exposed to the idea of the theory of evolution in science class to not reject it. The third battlefield is the industrial war on science. This is probably the most problematic right now. It has to do with opposition to regulation. And the argument that you will often hear from corporations is that we need freedom. Freedom is the opposite of regulation, they'll say, when in fact regulation actually increases freedom by protecting individual people from the third party effect or the neighborhood effect. So generally it's in these industries: tobacco, chemical, carbon dioxide, farming, pharmaceutical, sugar, and mining. Most of them are kind of commodities industries that are limited somehow in their profit potential by regulations that they want to oppose. So instead of adopting their business models, they fight the science by using public relations to create uncertainties. That's the core strategy, is to create uncertainty in the public mind about science. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of how that's done, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. In 1968, the American Petroleum Institute commissioned Stanford Research Institute to do a study on whether or not all this talk that was emerging about climate change from scientists was actually real or not, and something they had to be worried about. And the report concluded that significant temperature changes are almost certain to occur by the year 2000, and they could bring about climate change. They actually hit it pretty well on the head. It's not bad for a 1968 level of knowledge. 30 years later, that same group, the American Petroleum Institute, commissioned a very different report. Instead of going to Stanford Research Institute, they went to public relations experts, and they assembled a team of 12 of them. And I go over this in the book. And really that team developed a strategy. Whoops. I don't know how that happened. Sometimes that happens. Okay, let's see if we can do it without that ending. Okay, to emphasize the word uncertainties. In fact, you'll see it throughout this, that victory will be achieved when average citizens understand or recognize uncertainties in climate science. And when the media recognizes uncertainties, and when the media actually recognizes the validity of viewpoints that challenge the conventional wisdom. So the strategy is throughout the paper, but it's also throughout the communications that emerged from energy companies since then. And the idea is that, science is never certain. We want certainty, but science is never certain because it's based on inductive reasoning. And deductive reasoning says, it goes like this, basically. If I look around and I see 50 swans, and then the next day I see 50 more swans, and I do that for a year, eventually maybe I can make a generalization and say all swans are white. But if I'm being honest as a scientist, I'll say, no, I can't really do that because I can't see the entire universe at once. So I can't make a truthful statement in that way. And that's where math and statistics come into science. then I need to quantify the relative probability that all swans are white, or maybe there's a non-white swan somewhere. So this takes advantage of that little bit of uncertainty that science always keeps, because there may be some discovery somewhere that changes our perspective on something. That doesn't mean, however, that the whole thing is going to get overturned. It means that there will be minor changes, and the more experiments we do, the more certain our knowledge becomes. So this is driven by a guy named Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew. Edward Bernays created the field of public relations, except back then he called it the field of propaganda. Came out of the Catholic Church, the Office for the Propagation of the Faith. But propaganda got a bad name after the Germans used it, so he changed it to the field of public relations. And we're governed, he said, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind. And what he did was he developed through some very sophisticated psychological science, public relations campaigns that would change attitudes of the general public. The one that he's probably most famous for was his first one. The American Tobacco Company came to him and said, you know, women don't smoke enough. Women hardly smoke in public. It's taboo. We want you to change that, because if you can change that, we will double our market. So he started thinking, how can he do that? And he talked to his uncle, but he mostly talked to one of his uncle's students about how he could do this, get some psychological insight on it. And that person said, well, cigarettes are a phallic symbol. They're a symbol of power. They're like a penis. And women, if we emphasize that, women will want to smoke because they'll reclaim their power. So he developed this idea of having he hired a famous suffragist to, in turn, hire several debutantes who they purposely described as attractive women to walk down the Easter parade in New York City on Fifth Avenue, prominently smoking cigarettes. And he hired all kinds of his own photographers, but he did press releases about this, and they called those cigarettes torches of freedom. So he really co-opted the women's movement in a lot of ways for the purposes of a corporation. And it's the first time that the word freedom was really prominently used by a corporation, and it's become a very, very successful word for corporate PR since then. And in fact, women did take up smoking in considerable numbers across the country. One of the most important elements of this, though, was that for a long time no one knew that Edward Bernays had anything to do with this. Otherwise, women probably would not have done that. They thought that this was a spontaneous demonstration. This is something that he called the third party technique, and he wrote about it quite extensively. And it's something that is still used in PR campaigns today, where corporations initially start with creating fake science in fake journals, and then they create slanted press materials that they feed to bloggers attacking the real science and scientists. They fund the creation of front groups to whip up grassroots anger and frustration about whatever they want to change that's supported by science. Then they hire scientists to proselytize opinion leaders in communities. And once in the press, then the story, and as soon as somebody writes an article about it, the story is amplified by the yellow media, the people like Rush Limbaugh on the radio, the slanted news, the Fox News, anybody that has a slant, they will pick this up, they're allies. And at that point in time, a sympathetic lawmaker will propose a bill to address this problem. So this appears then to be something like the torches of freedom that's bubbling up from society, when in fact it's really being driven by one of the interested parties. And at that point, that innocent corporation can then take the stage to say, well, I think that we support this lawmaker's bill, that opposition to it would limit freedom and cost American jobs. And that's how it's done. And it's done over and over and over. So how did it play out in the climate bill? This is a fascinating case history of how PR, for the price of a couple $100 million, changed American history. Here's President Obama in his very first speech before Congress as president.
I ask this Congress to send me legislation that places a market-based cap on carbon pollution and drives the production of more renewable energy in America.
All right, 3 months later or 4 months later, Congress complied.
The bill is passed.
There were 8 Republicans that voted for it. Now, it must have seemed to many like it was a foregone conclusion. They got it through the House. So the Senate was controlled by Democrats. He had a supportive president. How come we didn't get cap and trade? Because energy companies and their PR machines executed a brilliant strategy. Americans for Prosperity is 4 times the size of the Republican Party. And it's funded by the Koch brothers largely.
I'm Tim Phillips, president of Americans for Prosperity. We're here in Billings, Montana.
We certainly did TV ads, radio ads, social media. We did rallies, events. We launched something we call Hot Air.
And we're sending a message to Senator Baucus and Senator Tester to vote no on this job-killing, tax-increasing cap and trade.
We got a hot air balloon, put a banner on the side of it that said cap and trade means higher taxes, lost jobs, less freedom. And we're all over the country doing events and stirring up grassroots anger and frustration, concern.
Cap and trade will slow the economy and cost American jobs.
Then they hired spin artists from Americans for Prosperity and the Cato Institute, which was originally founded by the Koch brothers as well as the Koch Foundation, changed its name later.
The right response to the non-problem of global warming, next slide please, is to have the courage to do nothing.
But the fear of catastrophic man-made global warming is mistaken.
This demonstration shows that the oft-repeated mantra in Washington, quote, "the science is settled," is not true at all.
So lawmakers began hearing it in their committee hearings. They began seeing it in these public demonstrations. They began seeing TV ads in their districts. And then they began hearing it from some of their wealthiest donors as these hired scientists went out to proselytize opinion leaders in communities.
There hasn't been any perceptible trend. In the last 10 years, there hasn't been any warming. We don't know why that is, but one doesn't see any warming in the observations.
Now, Fred Singer is well known as a climate denier. Before that, he argued that cigarettes don't cause cancer. He's also a very well-respected scientist before he became kind of contrarian. And he's got a nice grandfatherly affect to him, and you kind of want to believe him. He sounds reasonable and seems reasonable. But this idea that we don't know why there hasn't been any warming, but there hasn't been, is just plain false, as Gavin Schmidt from NASA will describe.
You could take the entire climate history that we have in the instrumental record, and you could find cooling trends every 10 years.
Cooling trends between 1958 and 1969, 1969 and 1978, 1978 and 1987, and so on. Scientists have a name for this. They call it going down the up escalator.
You pick the endpoints, and you could find any particular year as part of a cooling year. But actually, the whole thing has been moving up.
If you look at all of the data, it's quite clear that the warming is continuing.
And that's the question with statistics and the role of statistics and where science can be played with by limiting the endpoints that you look at. That's the same problem, for instance, that the World Health Organization got into when they said that your cell phone may cause brain cancer. So you have to take a broad enough sample for it to be meaningful. So then these folks really started getting active in opposing Republicans in primary battles. Why do that if it's the Democrats in the Senate that were going to vote on this? Why oppose Republicans in the House? For the purpose of intimidation, to further underscore this narrative that they were creating, that there is a groundswell of anti-climate movement among the people that actually even knocked out Republicans.
Now, how many times has an incumbent who isn't in prison or facing a prison sentence lost his own primary by 79 to 21%? This was overwhelming. But what's happened is...
The smile on your face suggests, man, we won one.
Of course we won one.
We're on the record. And our grandchildren or great-grandchildren are going to read.
This climate hearing in the lame duck Congress was Inglis's last.
Your child is sick. 98 doctors say treat him this way. 2 say no, this other is the way to go. I'll go with the 2. You're taking a big risk with those kids.
Thank you.
It was a very key factor in 10 to 15 congressional districts in the 2010 election where strong supporters of climate change legislation ended up being defeated.
And there was nothing like a loss in an election to promote fear in the survivors. And that's exactly what happened in the United States Congress.
Indeed. So a short time after that, in the summer of 2010, we saw the leader of the Democrats in the Senate say that he no longer had the votes to pass cap and trade, that the Democratic senators had become too nervous. Those of them in swing districts thought that they might lose, so they had removed their support. So in terms of the size of the energy industry, for the relative pittance that they spent on this, they got an enormous bang for their buck. It was a brilliant PR campaign. So why does all this matter? Isn't democracy just about different opinions, and aren't we supposed to have freedom of speech, and isn't my opinion just as valuable as yours and vice versa? Not necessarily if they're not based on actual knowledge. So this goes back to Jefferson and his idea of the trinity of 3 greatest men. That's what he called them: Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, and John Locke. When he was sitting in that hot little room in Philadelphia drafting the Declaration of Independence, he went back to their thinking, and he synthesized their thinking essentially into the idea that if any one of us in this room can discover the truth of something for him or herself using science and reason, then no king, no pope, and no wealthy lord is more entitled to govern than we are ourselves. And that was a foundation of the idea that all men and women are created equal. So if we abandon that, where does it lead us? This is Jefferson's concept of democracy, kind of a virtuous circle. There was a governance issue. To solve it, we would reach out to the educated and informed mass of the people through their elected representatives. They would commission scientific research to build knowledge, and based on that knowledge, we would debate the best public policy. But under the war on science, we've seen instead vested interests providing alternative theories to children and propaganda to adults. We've seen then those people turn to authority and ideology for knowledge instead of scientific research. And then instead of debating the best policy based on knowledge, we base it on dogma. What is that for? It's a recipe for transforming democracy to authoritarianism. And this is something I've been talking about. I've used a slide for the last 8 years. And since I began using it, we have in fact seen a vast rise in authoritarianism throughout the world. So my last little story here is a little ditty about Jack and Diane. I don't know if there's any Mellencamp fans in the audience, but Jack is a lawyer and Diane is a scientist. And the reason that it's kind of a poignant story is because it's about the differences in interpretation of science. I guess my clicker doesn't work. So Jack is, he goes out to lunch with some colleagues at a professional association. He works in government relations in his firm as an attorney, and they hear Fred Singer talking about, we don't know why, but we haven't really seen any warming in the last 10 years. That's kind of interesting. Okay. A lot of the guys talk about that on the ride home, how smart that guy seems, and we're not scientists, but he seems credible. He really certainly knows what he's talking about. So that's a little chunk of information that, of evidence that Jack stores away. Well, then Jack is back at the office, and he knows his wife is a scientist, Diane's a scientist, and he wonders what she'd think about this. So he goes online and he does a little bit of research, and he course, goes to the Drudge Report. It's a nice source of news and information. And he sees a headline talking about how NOAA fiddles with climate data. Huh, the government's fiddling with climate data. That must mean people with an agenda are in the government. And that satellite data shows no global warming for nearly 19 years. So that's another little chunk of evidence that he stores away in his mind. The colleagues that he works with, they talk at the water cooler a couple hours later, and they say, God, that guy was really great. He really knew his stuff, right? So we have a little bit of peer pressure at work here. That's another chunk of evidence, because all these guys are smart guys and women that he serves with, right? So they must know what they're talking about. Then he does a little bit of research because he tries calling his wife, but she's stuck in the lab. He knows she's a climate scientist, and he can't get her. So he goes online and he finds a report of the NIPCC. We all heard of that? No, we heard of the IPCC, not the NIPCC. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations initiative. This is the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, and it's actually a propaganda report prepared by the Heartland Institute. The Heartland Institute prepares these things to look like they're actually scientific reports. And in fact, they mail them and their newspaper out to every sitting legislator and congressional officer in America on a regular basis to alter their thinking. So here's another little bit of evidence that he chunks away that scientists really disagree about global warming. Then on his drive home, he tunes into talk radio for a little kick, and there's Rush Limbaugh saying that it's a hoax. Climate change is a hoax, and its target is you, people of the United States of America. Another chunk that he files away. He looks at the environmental and climate news on his seat, which he gets monthly. And it talks about how there's a doubt about climate change, and he thinks about that. In fact, that's the publication that the Heartland Institute puts together. The innocuous name of Environment and Climate News when it's about anything but. He passes a billboard on the way home. Wind dies, sun sets. Obviously, there's a lot of public concern about this and debate about it. Another chunk that he files away. He's trying to be a good dad at home. His wife's still stuck at the lab, and his daughter is hungry, so he's making dinner for everybody. He turns on the news, and he sees a report on Fox News about how there's a debate about climate change, and the whistleblower at NOAA talked about manipulating the data. So there's, again, another chunk of information from people smarter than him in the know that are talking about how this is an issue. Well, his wife gets home, and she says, no. Here's the real evidence, and she shows him a paper on climate change from the National Academy of Sciences and says, you really should read this. This is what's got the real evidence. So that's a chunk of evidence on her side that he accumulates. Well, Cindy's getting tired, but she's got to finish her homework. And she says, Daddy, can't you please help me? So he helps her, and he, in her science textbook, he sees this passage. Provided courtesy of the Heartland Institute, by the way. Is global warming a result of human activity? In fact, it reads, scientists agree that Earth's climate is changing. They do not agree on what is causing the change. Is it just another natural warming cycle like so many cycles that have occurred in the past? Scientists who support this position cite thousands of years worth of natural climatic change as evidence. Or is climate change anthropogenic, caused by human activity? Scientists who support this position cite the warming effect of rapidly increasing amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases occur naturally, but they also occur as a result of human activity burning fossil fuels. Which side's evidence is more convincing? First of all, science isn't about which side. That's a legalistic argument, a rhetorical argument. But it also is, again, very subtly about casting uncertainty about science. So there's another little bit of evidence he chunks away. Well, he's conflicted about that, so he posts Diane's info online about the National Academy's report, and he finds himself in a Facebook smackdown. His friends and their friends, people he didn't even know, are just smearing him and slamming him on Facebook, and he's publicly embarrassed and shamed for the position that he's taken. So that begins to obliterate a little bit of Diane and her evidence over there. And you can see that this is beginning to be a little bit of a tragedy. Over 30,000 scientists say catastrophic man-made global warming is a complete hoax and science lie. A friend shares him this article. And neither one of them know that the scientists in the Oregon petition are actually anybody with a BS degree. That's how you get classified as a scientist, have a bachelor's of science degree. All right, another chunk of evidence. The next day he takes his daughter to church. They go to a nice mega church, and he hears the Cornwall Alliance doctrine about how we're stewards of the environment, and God said that the world is not going to end in a flood. We're not going to worry about climate change. The humans can't cause that. That's up to God. He does a little bit more reading to get both sides of the debate. Already his thinking is polluted there. So he goes on the leading news source now, Breitbart, and he sees a lot of different headlines there. Global warming is good, says President Trump's science guru. Climate change skeptics welcome open debate under Trump presidency. Leading climate alarmist Donald Trump should kill himself immediately, says the scientist, basically. And then, of course, there's a story in there about virtual reality porn as the best way to satisfy sexual needs. So all mainstream news stories that are, of course, interesting, but it again lines up several chunks of new evidence that he concludes that maybe there really isn't anything to this, and maybe his wife is being deceived. His boss, one of the senior partners, says, hey, don't worry about it. Debate is good, right? Debate is good. From an attorney point of view, it probably is, but not if you're not basing it on evidence. He has beers with a client in lieu of golfing because it snowed, and the client says, some global warming, eh? And they laugh about that. So socially, he's got some motivation to not accept that. And then, of course, he sees James Inhofe and his snowball on TV. So what has that done to his relationship with Diane? He goes along to get along with the guys, right? And everything's easier in his life except that relationship. So he starts thinking of her as, maybe she's just touchy-feely and she's a tree hugger. He can diminish her and use sexism to dismiss her arguments and the evidence that go along with it. 2 years later, they get divorced, and Diane says this is the moment she lost him. Now, this is actually a real thing that happens to your friends, your family members, your neighbors. We all make conclusions about what we believe about the world based on the evidence that we are surrounded with. And in Jack's case, it's a reasonable thing to conclude, but he's become trapped in, speaking of virtual reality, a pre-engineered, immersive, self-referential reality net created by professional societies, conservative news sites, fake scientific reports, group peer pressure, slanted TV news, slanted talk radio, school textbooks, print news, churches, elected officials, social media, friends, and trolls, fake news, fake history. In fact, this is the same strategy that Edward Bernays used and that the Creel Commission used to convince Americans to go into World War I. Surround people with evidence that presents a certain slanted point of view, and they will believe it. But what does this do? It creates a tarball, scientists call it. All these different sources of denial cross-corroborate one another. They support each other's point of view, and when one gets trapped in one and slips into it, it's like getting caught in an intellectual undertow. So he gets caught in this web, but what is that web really similar to? In some ways, it's similar to cult behavior. Cult characteristics, if you study cults at all, they are similar to the science denial movement. They involve a deeply partisan allegiance to a strong creed or authority figure. They involve denial of conflicting information. We have the truth and you don't. They involve deception and coercion in their persuasion techniques. They're authoritarian with an us versus them worldview and scapegoating of others. Their ideology explains everything. It's unfalsifiable. There are personality changes in people who undergo this. Confrontation causes them not to change their mind, but to double down. Leaving causes identity loss. If you are surrounded by all of this, how could you have been wrong? Most people that leave a cult take about 2 years to really recover psychologically from it. So thinking about this, it's possible that our president is not lying when he says that climate change is a hoax. It's possible that he's basing that on a reasonable assessment of the evidence that he's been surrounded with by the source of information he's using. So concluding this, I want you to think about a few quotes here. This is a worldwide hoax, said Rush Limbaugh. The greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people, said Senator Inhofe. It's a money-making industry, okay? It's a hoax, a lot of it, said President Trump. Similar language, though, was used in Weimar Germany in 1920, when right-wing relativity deniers attacked Einstein's theory and called it Jewish science and, quote-unquote, a hoax. The world is a strange madhouse, Einstein wrote a friend at the time. Currently, every coachman and every waiter is debating whether relativity theory is correct. Belief in this matter depends on political party affiliation. Does that sound familiar? Now, I'm not going to go through, the book has 14 different battle plans. I'm not going to go through all of those right now because we're late on time, but I wanted to talk about just one. I told you a little bit about science debate. I think that Dick mentioned the March for Science that I was a little bit involved in. The most important thing that you can do if you care about facts, if you care about reason in public policy, is speak up, take some kind of action. Science debate wound up changing the Obama presidency. He was not a science-friendly president or candidate when he first started campaigning. But we dogged him and dogged him until he finally had to put together a science advisory team. And that team helped him answer the questions. He wound up appointing some members of that team and some of our early supporters to his cabinet, including his presidential science advisor, John Holdren, his energy secretary, Stephen Chu, his director of NOAA, Jane Lubchenco, his head of the U.S. Geological Survey, Minnesotan, Marcia McNutt. Several other people were involved in the science debate effort that wound up being appointed by President Obama, making his presidency arguably one of the most science-informed and evidence-informed presidencies in American history. So that was 6 people. So the people in this room should be enough to change the world, right? So I want to leave you with that thought, that by acting on your convictions, by being that irritating person that doesn't go away, by contacting your legislators and asking them to base their decisions on evidence, instead of making decisions like our Minnesota legislature is tonight actually, behind closed doors, away from the public instead of in front of public scrutiny. By holding those elected officials to account, we really can turn this around and change the world. So thank you very much. Do you want to do Q&A, or where are we at on time? Do you want to do any Q&A, or?
Open to questions.
Okay, and if anybody feels that they need to leave in the middle, that's fine. I'm not going to be offended. Oh, by the way, like Dick said, I do have a couple of books here too at the end if you'd like. $20. Yes, sir.
I have a hard time with, obviously lung cancer is caused by smoking and everybody has no problem with that, but on a smaller scale, when there are few studies produced, how do you trust the science when the money behind it is often a corporation whose bottom line is only shareholder value?
Yeah.
Or even the fame of the person that is producing the study, and how many studies just get shelved because they don't support what, they never get published because they didn't support what.
Right. Yeah. So the question is, how do you How do you account for when a single study says something about a topic, and how do you trust science on that basis? Especially if the study's funded by corporate interests or motivated by the scientist's own ego. And that's a big problem, actually. And one of the things that science does to get around that, because it's another form of confirmation bias in a different way, or certainly another form of bias, is relying on the process of peer review and on publication and submission of science to the possibility of falsification. So that's where the word consensus really comes into play. Science that is just informed by a single study is almost meaningless. It's the next best thing to somebody's opinion that they pull out of wherever. I'll give you an example of that. There's a guy that actually did an expose on dietary science and all these things like, chocolate is good for you or bad for you, red wine is good for you or bad for you. And he did something called p-hacking, where basically he had a control group and he did an experiment where he tracked people on 30 or 40 different variables over the course of 6 weeks. How happy they were or depressed they were, what they weighed at the beginning, at the end, what their glycol levels were, all kinds of different physiological, psychological, and social variables. And then at the end, he looked for what they had done that he could make an argument out of. And he found that, in fact, I'm sorry, I forgot. He had people eat a certain amount of chocolate every day. And at the end, he found a statistical blip where a certain number of people had lost weight. So he published, and this was a hoax to draw people out, but he published on this and said that eating chocolate once a day will help you lose weight. And here's the evidence to show it. But what he was doing actually with that p-hacking was he was going with the benefit, using this statistical trick, the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, and cherry-picking information, just like climate deniers do, cherry-picking information that fit his predetermined argument. And using that to expose how media gullibly takes this information from a single study and it will travel around the world. And what that does is it winds up eroding public trust in science, because you hear these different conflicting things that media really shouldn't probably be giving them as much weight as they do. So that is a big issue that science works in its method to overcome through the development of consensus, which is accomplished by a number of scientists publishing on a topic. But if something doesn't have a lot of support, then you probably should not be giving it a lot of credence.
But very few things have the broad range of studies that smoking and climate change do. Right?
Smoking, climate change, evolution, quantum theory, all of those things are among the most supported. Those are probably the most supported science that we have. And then it goes down from there in degrees. Yes. Gravity, that's another one. Yes?
That story about how cap and trade failed was so disturbing to me, because I looked at how fast that happened. It would cook like that. And
right.
I have never heard that story before. Now, are you the first person to tell us?
I'm the first person that tells it that way, but it's been told before by others. And I write about it in the book as well. Yeah, I mean, this is really the triumph of public relations, which I call the dark side of journalism, because almost all public relations people, it seems to me, have once been journalists, and then they go into the business of professionally manipulating their former colleagues. But yes, it's a big problem, and it has to do with then the role that we give to corporate speech in our society, and whether a corporation should have the same level of amplification of voice as an individual should. And that's an issue that is actually being, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's actually being compounded, if you think about it, in our social media today. Because our social media, these are basically private companies using algorithms that have taken over, essentially, privatized our public square. Public square used to work where an individual would show up and stand on the soapbox and voice their opinion, and thereby take accountability for it, because you could see their face. And everybody had about the same level of projection, more or less. That changed with media. And every time there's been a new source of media that amplified the voices of some, it's caused social upheaval. Nazis in the run-up to the war used media very effectively, the new radio in particular, the Volksempfänger, which they created and gave away very cheaply, and then they filled with propaganda. So they distributed this mass psychology. It was also done in a variety of other ways, film strips and loudspeakers in the back of vehicles, etc. Then we saw a similar social upheaval really begin to happen with the advent of cable television and the broad distribution of various slanted media. And now we're seeing another change in that and another social upheaval through social media and the internet. And it's become a very interesting challenge, because how do you determine who should have a voice and what is the best way to balance different conflicting interests in a democracy? Of course, corporations should have a certain level of right to defend their position, but how does that balance with the rights of an individual? And that's really the problem that I don't think that we have solved. Yes?
Thank you very much. This is a fascinating talk. I just had a comment to what she said. There are two documentaries that kind of expand on this idea of the cap and trade story.
Mm-hmm.
One is called Climate of Doubt. It's on PBS. It's
Okay.
free. And one is called Merchants of Doubt. And
Yep.
that kind of takes you from the playbook that you really beautifully showed from the smoking industry up to climate change now, and how the same playbook has been used over and over.
Yes.
So those are two documentaries that are really helpful.
Yeah.
So.
Merchants of Doubt is based on Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's book by the same name. Yeah, there's another one that I would recommend actually that's sort of similar but much broader, but it's fascinating, and it's called The Century of the Self. It's very, very difficult to find in the US, but it's an internationally award-winning BBC documentary. You can find it on YouTube. That's the only place I've been able to find in the US. It's about a 4-hour documentary, but I tell you, it'll be the most mind-blowing documentary you've ever seen. And it actually goes into Edward Bernays a little bit and the growth of micro-targeting in politics and the effect that that's had.
What is the name of it again?
The Century of the Self.
The Century of the Self.
BBC, yes. Yes?
Yeah, I thank you for your talk. I think it has fascinating lessons to it, but I do have some critical points to make. Because I think, in a little way, you say you have multiple wars on science. You describe very different phenomena. You describe very different issues. And I think you are a little bit too easy on the science, because there is what you say, objectivity and evidence a lot. But there are a lot of matters where there's simply uncertainty. Even among scientists will say that too. And
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So I think, and you're basically what, I mean, I'm simplifying this probably, but you're saying if we had the good evidence, we'll have good democracy, but now we have this war on evidence, and that's where we have authoritarianism. And I mean, political scientist and a democratization study and a food politics researcher, so you have a lot of things mixed in your arguments, and I think you should be very careful to set apart a little bit, because you are falling prey to your own argument that you're oversimplifying a few of the wars that are going on, which are spurred actually by different dynamics and different reasons, and they're very different because I'm also German in the United States than in Germany. And it's not the same all over. It's not a world encompassing war.
Oh, yes.
It's many wars, and it has many facets, and I think
It's many wars.
Yeah, and I think since you have so much voice, you should add complexity to your voice in that.
Well, I'm sorry if it didn't come across as complex enough. I certainly try to.
I know what you're saying. I mean this as a scientist, because we always want to write our arguments better.
Yes.
And we do that by controversy.
Absolutely.
And that's
So let me respond to a few points. I too spend a lot of time in Germany. My mom actually is German. And it's true, throughout the EU, but especially in Germany, the concern is more about making certain that the people have a voice in the government-funded science that's done. And it's a different concern, but it's an aspect of the same problem. And my premise here is that, in essence, that when there is a war on science, it is essentially an attack by somebody's vested interest. whether it's an ideological or an economic or a political vested interest. They don't like what the evidence says, so instead of debating accepting the evidence and saying, all right, I will change my opinion based on the evidence if you are able to show evidence that shows that I'm wrong, they say, I'm going to argue with the science, and I'm going to try to discredit the science. I'm going to develop arguments that cast doubt on the science. And that's what all three of those sources do for their own reasons, but a lot of it has to do with being a vested interest and protecting that.
Yeah, and if I may add, I mean, science is hugely political in itself, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Funding has changed over time, so the objectivity of science, both humanities, liberal and social sciences, and like hard sciences, like there's a big debate among the scientists about like science and technology studies that actually makes, you know, the evidence objectivity claim a little more nuanced.
Yes, although science and technology studies are not scientists.
No.
That's a field of postmodernism, and that has to do with, again, this idea of different ways of knowing. And it's a philosophical field, not a science field.
Well,
So, but we can have more discussion about that, yes.
We could take this off stage, that's okay.
Okay.
I actually might jump in on that as well. I'm also a scientist, and I think that you touched on this at the beginning, right? That scientists kind of got caught in their own world, right? And so
yes.
Scientists are caught in this world of like complete fascination with complexity. And what ends up happening, I think, is that scientists suck at telling stories.
Absolutely.
And so we get so caught in complexity and the fascination with the one little 1% that's unknown that there's still this divide between the science and the public. And so I'm kind of curious to hear, like, from you, you know, what can scientists do? Because we're not good at telling story. We're not good at narrative. We're not good at embracing the public opinion.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is, it's a little bit ironic because science itself essentially is a giant narrative.
Exactly.
You know, it's writing down what we've learned about the world. But it's very true, and I spend a fair amount of time talking to scientists about how to communicate more effectively. And a lot of it has to do with understanding the way that the human brain is wired, and how we think about reality, which has to do with values and narrative. And if a scientist can communicate in those terms, then they can be more persuasive. But that is sometimes kind of anathema to the scientific method, because it starts with the predetermined conclusion that you're trying to get to and then persuading people on it. On the other hand, that's an appropriate use of tools in a certain circumstance, right? It's appropriate to make a rhetorical argument in some cases, as long as you are also using evidence. But there are a lot of science communicators now that are putting some more thought into this and actually doing science about it to figure out how to be more effective. And I think that we'll see some significant progress on that in the next 10 years. Hopefully that'll be soon enough. We got one in the back.
Last question.
Okay. Hi, Jay. How are you? It's been a while. Yeah.
I really congratulate you for this exhaustive work, and you're a pioneer. But let me ask you, you beautifully demonstrated how humans, for selfishness, accept part of the science. Donald Trump likes the part of science that helps him build fancy casinos.
Yeah.
Casinos. Or Koch brothers building bombs and weapons for profit. But they reject the part that's against their interest. Is that part of our nature, that we are genetically made up to be selfish, so this war is going to go on internally?
It's been there as long as science has been. Thanks for that question. And I think that it is a part of our nature. If you think about it, we all navigate the world through persuasion to get what we want or what we need. And when somebody like the Koch brothers, for instance, use that example, accepts part of the science and denies or funds denial of the other part, that's doing exactly that. And that is actually an anti-science position that they take. Although I say the Koch brothers aren't anti-science, they're very pro-geological science. They're just anti-other kinds of science. But I think that that's certainly a danger that we all face, and that's part of the whole knotted up ball of confirmation bias that the scientific method has always struggled with helping us get past. The issue is when we start basing public policies on things other than evidence, or when they're not supported by evidence, we move away from what can be demonstrated as being in the best interests of the most people, and more towards what works for the few who have made the strongest argument, whether the evidence supports it or not. And so in that sense, it certainly is a very powerful political debate that we're having right now. It's worse right now because there's more money behind it, and there's faster change, and there's less public understanding, all combined. So we're creating this perfect storm that has accelerated science denial to a point that we've never seen before. So what I'm trying to do, and what people that communicate like me are trying to do, is to, first of all, bring that to the public's attention, get people to think about it, get people to think again about the role of democracy and evidence in democracy, and our personal involvement in it. And hopefully through enough conversation about it, we can spur some critical thinking and at least begin to advocate for our own interests more successfully. So,
wow. We could go on forever on this, I'm sure.
How does Galileo's dealing with church hierarchy fit into our world today, dealing with some of these things?
Well, it's a very similar thing. What Galileo did, basically, he looked through a telescope, and he saw because of evidence, he saw the phases of Venus, and he saw moons traveling around Jupiter. He could conclude, based on observational evidence, the first time anybody had actually done that no, the sun didn't go around the earth, it was the other way around. That challenged, again, the power structure. At that point in time, the Catholic Church was the center of economic and philosophical power in the world. And what he was saying basically was deposing what they were arguing. And that posed a political threat that made what he was saying untenable. Galileo has lots of fascinating quotes about different aspects of this that we don't have time to go into right now. But I think that the dynamic that we saw there in that exchange really set forth a lot of the dynamic that we've seen ever since then. So anybody else that has a question, why don't you come on up? Again, I've got a couple of books here if anybody wants one that goes into much more depth on this. You might like one, and then we can argue online. And I want to thank you all for coming again.